Welcome back to Alberta Primetime and our Wednesday Vocal Point panel on crime now. Canada's Governor General says our judges and lawyers have lost sight of justice and the public good, as well as the trust of ordinary citizens. Is he right? We'll ask our panelists. Retired criminologist Keith Spencer joins us tonight, also a former warden. Lawyer Rod Gregory is with us as well, and Calgary Herald crime reporter Jason Van Rassel. Thanks for being here, gentlemen. Good evening.
Good to be here.
In a speech at the Canadian Bar Association's annual convention days ago, Governor General David Johnston delivered rare, sharp criticism. He said Canada requires, quote, a new model for professionalism in law. At the same conference, a World Justice Institute study revealed Canada is 9th out of 12 European and North American countries for providing access to the courts. In other words, if you're not wealthy or too poor to qualify for legal aid, you're in trouble. Rod, you're a lawyer. What is David Johnston talking about more specifically, and do you think he's right?
Well, I don't agree with a lot of his comments. I know they were well received, but Chief Justice McLaughlin, in her comments, talked about the government's failing in giving access to justice for lower income individuals in Canada. That's been a huge failing for the government. So he's the Governor General. I think he should have pointed fingers at the government. In Alberta, if you have the income level of someone on AISH, you do not apply for you do not qualify for legal aid.
Wow.
It's absolutely terrible. And they've cut 30% of their funding. And so people who are facing family law crisis...
family law must be huge. I mean, everybody
huge.
thinks, oh, well, I'm not in court. But there are a lot of people who need the courts.
Everyone talks about the criminal defense bar, and they should be doing cases for free. We all do cases for free. And the judges and the prosecutors see the effects of the government cutbacks. But there's also the family law cutbacks and the civil law cutbacks where people don't have access to justice. It's not because lawyers aren't doing their share of work for free. It's because there is no access because of government funding.
Johnson did suggest that there should be more pro bono work. It's nice to have a frontline perspective from you. He also talks about delays in trials, lawyers' fingerprints all over, say, the fraudulent commercial paper collapse in Wall Street. As an example, law schools out of touch with real practice, penalizing people with family demands, women in particular, really broad criticisms. And Keith, is he right? You've dealt with countless convicts and lawyers in your career as a jail warden, a criminologist, a role leading the John Howard Society. What's your frontline perspective?
Well, I guess I could start off by saying there are lawyer jokes because for a good reason. I think that if you're really poor, you probably have a better chance of getting some kind of representation than if you're kind of in that middle class, where you really can't go anywhere without paying the full ticket. And I'm sensitive to the fact that big law companies, I think a lot of them really beat up their lawyers. They have to produce, they have to have be bringing in money for the firm, and I think it's a tough business. Now, the Governor General speaks from an interesting perspective because he was the dean of a law school, and I think that gives his comments some extra credibility in my mind.
Yeah.
And I think that lawyers have a unique position in society because if you look at the percentage of lawyers, for example, that get elected to the House of Commons and who get involved in politics and seek elected office, it's a reasonably high percentage for a single profession. So I think that who becomes lawyers is a very important issue, and that's why this selection process that revolves so much around the LSAT exam.
For law school.
Yes, without consideration like it happened in the old days of what your community service was.
Reference letters.
Your volunteer work and your reference letters. I think that's an issue. It's not the only issue, but I think it's an interesting issue too, is the whole selection process. And they become the pool, of course, for judges later on that really affect our whole perspective legally.
Jason, judges and lawyers, Johnson said, enjoy self-regulation and a monopoly on their profession, so in return they must not be complacent and must serve the public better. Complacency, I'm thinking he's referring especially to a lot of trials with long delays, but you cover the courts in your job as a crime reporter. Do you see complacency in Alberta courts?
The courts, although I think, well, not I think, they are one of the most public institutions in the land, but you do see sometimes this cloistered attitude among officers of the court. Certainly, we as journalists are members of the public, and we represent the public in the courts, and sometimes just asking the simplest of questions from officers of the court, whether it's to look at an exhibit, what the judge's name is when a certain case is coming up, sometimes elicits suspicion. And so you see that attitude a lot, but you also see some people who are very helpful. As far as delays go, you know, it certainly has been an issue over the years. Access to legal aid, as Rod has pointed out, is a pressure point, I think, right across the country, definitely here in Alberta. The one thing that Alberta is trying to do is to cut down on some of those delays in the justice. We've talked about it before on the show. There's the case management project that's going on in Alberta to try and streamline trial wait times and get more routine appearances out of the way quickly. But even that has its factors. For as much as some people like the speedier case times, there are other people that are saying that we're getting rid of due process that people deserve, you know, as one of the consequences. So, you know, this is a very fundamental issue to our entire democracy, and you're going to get a lot of debate, and it's very important for us to sort these things out. And I think the Governor General's comments attracted the most attention. Rod's hit on something very good, I think, though, by pointing out Chief Justice McLaughlin's comments, because she also had some very good things to say. One of those things that really caught my eye is she was saying that the criminal justice system attracts sort of the most attention, the most public debate, but that there needs to be greater access for Canadians to the courts and the legal system in everyday matters, whether it's about launching a lawsuit or seeking legal advice on your mortgage or a personal injury matter, that just many average Canadians on these day-to-day quotidian things are intimidated or possibly put off by the potential costs. And I thought that was very astute. And we've been talking about complacency. Here's the Chief Justice of our country, I think, making a very astute observation about the reality for a lot of average Canadians out there.
Rod, is that subtle pressure, and is there other pressure from the legal community on government to offer free legal seminars for people going through family law cases, divorce, needing to launch a lawsuit, needing to handle things for their business? Is there pressure, should there be pressure on government to provide more help?
Well, I know that family lawyers have an intense amount of pressure right now. They have to turn clients away. And so there should be, there should be a government-funded mediation project for family law. They've moved that way, but there's no funding for it. And if they can bring in mediators, the family lawyers want mediation. They only want to use custody battles or the courtrooms as a last resort, and they just don't have the resources. And I know the family lawyers would welcome that kind of program. It just doesn't exist.
Okay. When we return, what do the apparent drug-related shootings in Kelowna have to possibly do with what's happening in your community? Find out what our Wednesday Crime Panel thinks about that next. Welcome back to Alberta Primetime and our Wednesday Crime Panel. The shooting outside a posh Kelowna resort that has killed a notorious drug gang crime boss and injured several others is capturing Albertans' interest. And meantime, an RCMP report obtained under the Freedom of Information Act indicates the U.S. housing crash has Canadian marijuana growers moving south for cheaper properties. Jason, let's start with Kelowna. Jonathan Bacon, a notorious drug leader, was executed, 4 others wounded. Media is reporting on the 3 Bacon brothers' ruthlessness and powerful rise in the crime world. Does Alberta have anything similar, any kind of a dynasty, albeit perhaps a quiet one right now?
Nothing that I could really compare to. I mean, the gang situation in the Lower Mainland, where the Bacons came from, has been extremely volatile and really dynamic for years. We've seen outbreaks of violence here in Calgary, of course, in the early parts of the 2000s, up until probably about 3 or 4 years ago, when a real drastic action by police resulted in a lot of these guys being locked up since. And of course, a great number of homicides also cut into the ranks of the two warring gangs here in Calgary. You know, just as a side note, there's been a lot of speculation and frankly, I think a lot of hot air expended about the Kelowna shootings and what possible connection it could have to Alberta. And really, it's premature to talk about that because we have members of 3 different gangs that were in this car. Was Jonathan Bacon the primary target, or was the primary target somebody else he was with, or was it all 3 of them, you know, in terms of the gang members? Nobody knows. So without knowing that, knowing what potential impact it could have here in Alberta, it's really to speculate what it could. Now, police would be naive and they would be negligent not to have their ears to the ground and to make sure that, and not be listening for any ripples of violence here in Calgary. Criminal gangs straddle jurisdictions. They have affiliates and associates in different parts of the country. So, you know, publicly what you're finding here in Alberta is the police are dutifully supplying the right quotes for the journalists who are scraping around for any way to localize this story. But privately, I'm not hearing any heightened concern or any heightened sense of alarm over what's happened in Kelowna spilling over into Alberta.
Well, and Keith, during the break, you sort of said, you know, Alberta is more low-level hoodlums compared to the BC scene, but we have seen gang violence in our province in public areas. This one in front of a very public hotel, a popular resort, broad daylight. Lots of people could have been caught in the crossfire, and that's always the risk. People have been hurt, innocent bystanders, yet drug dealers don't pay taxes. They use our system. They cost us untold suffering and social supports. Are we too complacent about letting them run around with guns and doing their thing?
Well, I was just thinking how good it makes our disorganized, random total of 34 murders look compared to somebody that's running around with a machine gun in Kelowna or whatever on earth it was.
But why is the public angrier about that?
Well, because it's so visible, it's in public, and it involved, you know, that kind of weaponry that really gets people's attention. But I don't think we've got anything to compare with that, as Jason said, going on at the moment. And one of the realities is it's the laws themselves that cause a lot of this opportunity crime. And what I mean by that is that we've tried so hard to legislate morality, you know, the drugs, the alcohol, the prostitution.
And alcohol used to be illegal.
That's right. And when we look to the origin of organized crime in North America, it dates right back to the well-intentioned passage of prohibition laws, Al Capone, organized crime.
Right.
You have laws that don't, we have an overestimation of the power of laws. We have these laws that actually result in tailoring criminal activity in specific ways, and then lawyers and the police have to deal with it.
Just very quickly, Rod, the RCMP report obtained by newspapers suggesting Western Canadian grow-ups are moving south to take advantage of cheaper U.S. properties. Right. Alberta, are our weed growers staying put, do you think? Does this apply to them?
Well, BC has the climate for grow operations, so I think they're going to continue to have those. I think the point is bang on about legislating morality, and that's really what causes the gang violence in the drug trade.
Thank you all for your insights tonight. Joining us this evening, retired criminologist Keith Spencer, defense lawyer Rod Gregory, and Calgary Herald crime reporter Jason Van Rassel.